I think a lot of things about the conference. I think on the one hand, it's really a kind of historic moment that there is this conversation at all. When I began studying Tibetan Buddhism 30 years ago, nobody I knew had ever heard of it, had ever heard of the Dalai Lama, practically. And so the fact that now we're here engaging in this major Western cross-cultural conversation is really significant. And I also think that the project of bringing the two elements into conversation with each other, there is a huge danger, which I think this conversation has also demonstrated, enlightening it has been, of, you know, we have a certain grid with our Western mentality and perspective, and we value information, we value the brain, we value intellectual understanding, and this conference has been primarily directed at opening up intellectual understanding, which is very powerful. I think Alan's talk this morning about not idolizing anything is very significant, and yet I feel that the brain is being idolized and its information processing function is being idolized. Can't help it. That's the product of centuries of Western culture. I just think it's worth mentioning. The question today about prayer, for example, why hasn't this been mentioned? And as I said, I think it hasn't been mentioned because there's not a sensitivity to the kinds of learning that are involved in various contemplative practices that really are not about accruing more information. They're about developing stability, perhaps. They're about developing, with that stability, a different kind of perception of the body and a different engagement with the body. Prayer and its chanting and sacred words and so forth also vibrate certain parts of the body that Western medicine, Western science doesn't even talk about. The chakra system is well known throughout Asia. It's well known in contemplative practices. And as some of my new friends were, we were just talking now, that hasn't even been mentioned. And somebody last night said to me, the subtle body hasn't even been mentioned here. Now, this is kind of interesting. Everybody in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition who's at this conference knows quite well, at least conceptually, about Tantra, about the subtle energies that are actually central to transformation. There's no doubt it's not just that you need perception to be transformed as opposed to cognitive understanding. You actually have to rearrange the energies of your body. That's what enlightenment ultimately is, and no one has mentioned that. That's what it ultimately is from the point of view of the traditions that Tibetans regard as their most esoteric, their most swift and powerful methods. You have to reorganize the energies of your body, and that will change you. And you don't really have to debate with yourself on the level of information and changing ideation. And I think that that isn't present because it's not on the mapping. It's hard enough to get neuroscientists to talk about consciousness, actually, as Alan mentioned. And as I was just telling my friends, I was part of the Stanford conference with His Holiness this November, and one of the things that they said to us in preparation was, only half jokingly, they said, don't mention the C word. Don't talk about consciousness, let alone, but you can't appreciate what contemplative practice is without talking about consciousness and the subtle energies with which it is always united, and that when you change consciousness, you change energy. When you change energy, you change consciousness, and that's how transformation occurs. It doesn't happen just through getting information about smoking being bad for your lungs, as Mark said this morning. He didn't get it. He didn't change his habits until he heard the ping in the cardiogram. That was his body talking, in some sense. So I think that this is a wonderful conversation. I think it has a long way to go, and I think that it's going well enough that it will continue. And that's really good news. You know, I don't think that I'm in a position to predict where it will go. I think, if you like, I can say something about where I feel it should go and where I will probably suggest it goes this afternoon, and which I think Alan was really laying the ground for today. I think that we need to look at the way in which meditation changes subjectivity and start to recognize that consciousness with its twinning connection with energy, is profoundly transformable. Or we could say purifiable, to use a different metaphor. There is a potent element of the human dimension that intellectual knowledge simply doesn't address. Now, we need all the science, we need all of that to help us actually honor this other kind of information, because in our culture, in Western culture, we actually won't be able, as a culture, I think, to take it seriously without some holding hands with science. So I think this is very promising. I would like to see it explore not just mindfulness, but the way in which, and not just brain activity, but whole body activity. How do these energy flows in the body, how are they impacted by various kinds of practices? And how do they in turn impact not just view, but meditation and behavior? We're interested from the Buddhist side, certainly, I think from the scientific side too, we're interested in outcomes. We're not just interested, as Buddhist meditation, Hindu meditation, traditionally has not been just in some sort of interesting experience, of which there are untold numbers, but how does it actually impact you? How, when you walk out of your cave, when you walk off your meditation cushion, what do? How do you interact with other people? And I think we should perhaps ideally move away from the idea that what we're trying to measure is individual brain activity, not just brain activity and not just individuals either, but individuals impact each other profoundly. That's the whole significance of a teacher, of meditating in a group. We haven't talked about that. It's popped up a little bit. Sympathy, empathy, community have been very, very subterranean themes. And I think if we're going to understand how we as human beings work, we have to look at how we work when we interact, when we meditate together, for example. So I would like to see it really open these kinds of doors. And I think that would be very exciting. Okay. You know, I think it would have, maybe that the conversation was not, I guess I've been surprised in two different directions. I've been surprised at the openness and generosity of the participants, and I've also been surprised at the limitations of the conversation in the way that it unfolded. I'm not a long-time participant in these conversations. I was part of the Stanford conversation, but I haven't attended the Mind Life and so on. I haven't been following this for years and years. So I didn't know exactly what to expect. But the generosity of the participants has been very real. I think people have followed what Thupten Jinpa called a kind of intellectual etiquette to a certain degree. There's been respect, there's been no derision, and that's wonderful. You know, there's trust. You need a community of trust for this conversation to occur. I think it's beginning. I think, well, I was surprised how few women there are in this conference. There are some very accomplished women across these disciplines, and they should be more present. And in bathroom conversations, you know, people are saying, well, you know, maybe it'd be kind of a different conversation if you had more women. Maybe women are more ready to talk about the body and talk about energy, and for some reason, for many reasons. And so I think that's very important. I think the conference needs to be opened up in that way.